Thank you to all the members for supporting my channel. Hello there. Throughout Genshin's history, there have been a number of characters that have been disgustingly overpowered, and some of these characters I might give them their own video in the future, but for now, I want to talk about a handful of them in a shotgun fashion. And with me today, I have brought on Flip from YouTube. Say hi, Flip.
Hello there, I am Flip, another Genshin meta channel, and I primarily talk about leaked characters and do theory crafting around them. I do also sometimes like to talk about other people's Genshin takes, as it makes me feel much better about myself, as well as just trying to combat misinformation in the community.
Now, with that being said, here are the rules. We are only counting 5 stars from Genshin's history, because there are a couple of answers that would be a massive cop-out. When a lot of people think overpowered characters, some of the first things that come to mind is Zhongli, Bennett, Jingshou, Fischl, and a couple of others. Maybe Sucrose, for example. These characters are heavy cop-out answers, and they're also not really that interesting to talk about. A lot of people know that these characters are powerful, so we're just gonna skip over them. Another important rule, we will be talking about a character and how overpowered they were based off of a snapshot in time. Notice how the video is called in Genshin's history. There are some characters that are really weak now who at one point throughout their history were incredibly overpowered and dominantly game-breaking to the latter of extents. With that all being said, take away the first one, Flip.
I guess let's start things up by talking about the Honored one, a character with the team so good they had to alter future content around her. The first great singularity in the Genshin meta, Ganyu on her release. It is genuinely so hard to express to players who didn't play back in 1.0 how oppressive Ganyu was in the meta for multiple reasons, but I'm going to try and explain. For starters, Ganyu had 2 very distinct playstyles, both of which were just as effective as each other. The one I'm going to be highlighting is her melt charge attack playstyle that primarily focused on her frost flake arrows, and being able to melt these hits. You see, when Genshin wasn't scared of making characters that apply a lot of their element, you could get things like Ganyu's charge attacks that applied cryo within less than a second of each other and had 2 separate ICDs or internal cooldowns, meaning they would apply cryo very fast. Genshin normally has ICDs on abilities for most consistently hitting attacks, to where you're limited to the amount of the element you can apply. It is why even though Neuvillette's charge attack hits like 8 times, he will only apply Hydro around 3 of those 8 hits. It's just a way of balancing the game so you don't trigger too many reactions. But the thing is, for a lot of the older units, some of them just had abilities that ignored the ICD rule, even for their fast hitting attacks. And as I said, Ganyu was one of these characters with a charge attack. So when you combine this with Xiangling to apply pyro for Ganyu's melts, Bennett to buff Ganyu, and Zhongli or Diona so you don't get staggered, you had Ganyu's melt teams, which in a meta where the competition was Diluc Vape and no Dendro Kaching, she quickly outpaced every other on-field damage dealer at the time. This isn't even the only thing going for this playstyle as compared to Diluc, who had to use Prototype Archaic as his free-to-play weapon, or Kaching, who just didn't have a good one. Prototype Crescent was, and still is if you can get its passive off, one of the most insane bows in the game, giving 72% attack at R5, blowing every other low investment weapon out of the water. And unlike when you had to use this on Tartaglia and it went against this playstyle, Melt Ganyu teams are using charge attacks regardless, so this wasn't even a downside. Melt Ganyu is most likely one of the reasons why Hoyoverse is just never letting us get characters with consistent no ICD abilities again. Oh yeah, and this team is only one of the reasons why she was so strong. I haven't even talked about her Morgana teams. Back then, instead of the high HP pool, boss rush, abyss lineups that we have now, the spiral abyss used to be more like floor 10 and floor 11, to where it was mostly a mob clearing check, in which the Morgana team, which consisted of Ganyu, Mona, Venti, and another Cry unit, had a leash on every abyss lineup with minimal effort, until in Azuma where Hoyoverse actively decided to counter the team by changing the way the new enemies work. But to be honest, that's more of a Venti topic than a Ganyu one, so the leech over here can cover that.
How many of you actually played back in version 1? I would argue not many of you, and for that reason, Venti might be a very weird option to put in the top slot of the most overpowered characters in Genshin's history, and this is where I draw upon the earlier statement for the video. The fact of the matter is, throughout all of Genshin's history, there has yet to be a character as overpowered as Venti was on release. As long as the enemy wasn't a world boss, Venti was able to very easily and efficiently suck every enemy onto the field into a portal and deal a significant significant amount of damage to all of them while also buffing the team by swirling that element. And this had two effects, the main one being, if he swirled Pyro on his elemental burst, he would not only buff Pyro damage for that character, but Venti's burst would take on Pyro properties and it would start dealing a lot of Pyro damage, meaning his own burst got stronger when it infused with another character. And what a lot of people don't remember or simply don't know is back in the day, pretty much every single enemy in the game, with the exception of a couple of Lalatrolls and bosses, were afflicted by this buff. Venti's turret would suck in every single enemy without hesitation and crush them all until they were dead. It was to the point Venti was so overpowered that most people recommended you leave him at level 1, otherwise he would just kill everything before your other characters got a chance. And as somebody that used Venti in the very early days of Genshin, I must confirm this is in fact true. At the time, we didn't really have full teams of DPS characters, and Venti, as he was on release, was so disgustingly overpowered as a support that he was able to be your main DPS. Support the team by killing everything. The only way Venti was nerfed was by future enemies that were released throughout the course of time straight up being immune to CC. You can see this a lot in Inazuma with characters like the Mirror Maiden, Lalatrolls, Nagakiba, and most bosses completely being resistant or full-on immune to his CC effects. For that reason, Venti has slowly fallen off over time, but he still has factors of his really overpowered days, because the fact of the matter is, if an enemy can be CC'd, if a chamber of enemies can be CC'd, then Venti is an automatic full win button no matter what. So just remember, next time you go into Spiral Abyss and you're able to bring in Venti and he's full clearing by himself, that in early Genshin, he did the same thing, faster, better, and universally.
Alongside being the #1 official Glazer, I am also one of the top Furina salesmen, so it brings me great joy to be able to talk about one of my favorite units. And since Furina is still one of the most prominent forces in the meta, we are going to be just highlighting current Furina. Thankfully, I don't have to explain anything too complicated for this character as most of it is self-explanatory, but Furina's skill summons Hydro guys that will drain your HP, and when they do this causes them to deal more damage. A lot of damage actually, as this skill can contribute upwards of 20% of your team's damage output, even on Neuvillette teams. And then there's her burst, which even at C0 is able to give you a 75% damage bonus based on your HP fluctuations. In practice, unless you're using a team-wide healer, you won't be maxing this out consistently at C0, but even then it's still one of the strongest buffs in the game, even with a lower amount of fanfare, combined with Furina's damage profile. On release, when this character came out, she was just a massive damage increase to pretty much every talent's damage dealer in the game, giving them new top tier teams, most of which were better than their previous ones. Hu Tao, Linny, Neuvillette, Risley, Raiden, Wanderer, Xiao. Even some of the Dendro teams got boosted more, like Nilou Bloom and then Sino and Alhaitham Quick Bloom. And Furina was even more revolutionary than that actually if you think about it, because with the way her skill works, you want to run people that can heal you and offset her drain, which is obviously healers. For a long time in the meta, healers just weren't that good besides like Bennett. Hoyoverse just refused to make characters that could heal as well as offer an offensive impact to your teams. So healing or just a pure defensive option wasn't that valuable to clearing the Abyss, and for 80% of the characters you could just use Bennett. And with how the meta was before Furina, most of the time your other side was going to be a Dendro team that used Kuki, or just a team with no defensive option at all. However, Furina now makes it so that healing and having a lot of it is actually an offensive benefit to your team, bringing meta relevance to characters like Noelle, Jean, Mika, the newly released Charlotte, and so on, which is just not something I thought I'd ever say. The Regina of All Waters didn't stop there either, as she just got better every update with the new characters released. Navia giving her another carry to utilize, Xian Yun being a great healer for her teams and bringing more characters to the meta forefront like the Luke, Chlorant who's another great carry that can utilize her well on Quick Bloom or Electro Charge teams, Sijuin who, and even leading into Fontaine, she's a great option for Mualani and alright for Kinnick. Shalonen just gave her even more flexibility as well, being another great healer. And even the new characters Chaska and Auroron are going to have Furina as part of their best teams. She just enables most characters' best teams, on top of being so strong that she brought even weaker characters to the spotlight, and we are still currently in her era as her dominance is yet to stop.
Yeah, you all knew this one was coming. Let's talk about Neuvillette. In my opinion, in the modern day era of Genshin Impact, Neuvillette is one of the most disgustingly overpowered favorite things in the entire game. So much so, I even made a whole video talking about just him. Now, Neuvillette's strength doesn't necessarily come from being the best of the best in every situation. For example, a character like Mulaney technically outperforms Neuvillette in single target damage. However, Mulaney is clunky to play, and Neuvillette is not. The devil here is in the details, and the details are that Neuvillette is one of the most brain-dead easy characters to play in the whole game. Press skill, hold button. Press burst, hold button. Congratulations, enjoy your free win. If you really want to get freaky with it, you can just slap an auto clicker onto your device and make yourself spin at max degrees in a 360-degree angle, killing literally everything that spawns in before you even get a chance to see it. On top of that, Neuvillette is just really easy to build. Most characters want some sort of buffer, some sort of investment, some sort of signature weapon. Kujo Sara maybe a Bennett, how about a Kazuha or a Zillinan? Meanwhile, Neuvillette just wants a prototype Amber, optional. Because he scales entirely off of his HP stat, all you really need to do is get crit rate, crit damage, and HP scaling on him with a little bit of hydro bonus damage and maybe a hyper carry like previously mentioned, Zillinan and Kazuha, and all of a sudden you are pumping out an insane amount of damage. And while he may not be doing the most damage in something like single target as Mulaney and Kanich would do, his single target damage is still very impressive, and his multi-target damage puts every other character in the game to shame. As it currently stands, in my opinion, Neuvillette is the most overpowered DPS in the game for his universal applicability as well as his ease of building. There are very few scenarios which Neuvillette is not curb stomping the entire game. It's to the point where the only thing I can see realistically nerfing the man is the heavy inclusion of hydro enemies in both halves, but doing that would just negate one of the best elements in the game in general. And for that reason, I consider Neuvillette to be one of the best characters in all of Genshin's history.
Are you really going to make me talk about Nahida? Okay, fine. Next, let's talk about the little weed with her snapshot being throughout all of Sumeru. When Dendro first hit Genshin in 3.0, it was honestly not even that strong. It was released alongside the Dendro Traveler, who was okay, and Kole, who was more janky than the Blue Lock Season 2 animation, leading to all the teams you could create with it to be extremely limiting, and not that much better than the current teams. Cyno and Nilou, who were released afterwards with Dendro teams in mind, also were quite restricted by having to use those units. Nilou less so because Kole happened to be a really good partner for her, but still you could feel a quality of life gap. This all changed, however, when the Dendro baby came out. To give a rundown of why Nahida was so strong, her elemental skill applies a mark to enemies, and whenever a Dendro core like Hyper Bloom or Burgeon hits an enemy, or you trigger a reaction, the mark will apply Dendro with a cooldown of 2.5 seconds. And the reason why this is so broken is because you can mark pretty much every enemy in an abyss floor with it in 2 seconds or less, unless you're on control or have fun slowly spinning. And if you just triggered a reaction on one of them, all of them would take Dendro damage and have Dendro applied. This effect also lasted for 25 seconds as well. Her mark also applies a stronger Dendro than normal, so you can trigger more reactions off of it, or enhance things like Quicken, making it last even longer. And Nahida's burst was just a cherry on top, giving you elemental mastery, and buffing her mark even further. Now before discussing more about Nahida, we have to talk about Dendro reactions, mainly the seed ones and why they're so strong. Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon are all transformative reactions separate from the damage your character deals, and its damage only scales off of the triggering character's elemental mastery and character level, and you don't need to build crit stats or anything. Now normally transformative reactions weren't that great because of the thing I talked about before, ICDs. You just weren't applying enough of your element on enemies for it to be meaningful, but when a bloom reaction gets turned into a Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, it is a separate entity and therefore not affected by ICD. So this means that Electro or Pyro characters' Hyper Bloom and Burgeon triggers are only really limited by how fast they actually hit, and how many blooms you can trigger. And with Nahida, who just applies so much Dendro, and most frequent Hydra applicators like Yulan, Kokomi, or Xingqiu, you were able to make extremely functional transformative reaction teams. The teams that were standouts were double Hydra Hyperbloom teams with Raiden or Kuki as Hyperbloom triggers, in which all you really had to do was take your Hyperbloom trigger to level 90 and build EM on them, and the Hyperbloom damage alone gave you some of the cheapest, highest damaging teams in the game that was outperforming some of the best carries at the time. And I haven't even touched on the other 5 stars in Sumeru. Going back to Nilou, her Bloom teams were actually the best AoE teams in the game for a while until Neuvillette. Cyno gained actually competent Dendro teams like Quick Bloom, and then Alhaitham came out and his Quick Bloom teams were just a double Hydra teams but even stronger, as it now added Alhaitham's strong Quicken damage into the mix. These Dendro teams were so cheap to build that in Fontaine, Hoyoverse really had to step up how much damage the crit carriers were able to do. So yes, Nahida was absolutely a monster in the meta. Now back to you, HGC.
This one is gonna be a little bit of a tie. Kazuha and Zillinan are some of the most overpowered characters that have ever come out in Genshin's history, but and when you think about it, they don't really seem like they're that strong on their own. Whether you believe it or not, before Kazuha's release, Kazuha was actually considered to be not really worth the pull, because despite being able to shred resistance by 40% and buff damage percent by 40%, Kazuha was deemed not viable because most of the best in slot teams at the time, quite frankly, well, they didn't need a hyper carry buff. So what is a Kazuha to do? In recent eras, this is just, quite frankly, not even remotely true anymore. Kazuha and Zillion now are at the apex of the meta cycle, and the reason why they share this slot is because they are both overpowered for the same reason. Kazuha allows you to buff damage percent by 40% with a talent while also shredding resistance by 40% with an artifact set. Zillion shreds resistance with her talent while buffing damage percent with an artifact set, making her the inverse to Kazuha. And while Kazuha at peak performance does technically buff more, Zillion heals and Kazuha does not, which puts them in the same slot in my opinion. There is a reason why some of the most meme teams in the game require Kazuha and Zillion. Quite frankly, they just buff so much that any character can receive significant amount of damage percent simply by using them on the team. Pretty much any character that falls under the role of hyper carry will receive such a significant damage buff from these characters that it's not worth running them with anybody else. A really good example is Neuvillette, who is one of the most overpowered characters in the game, and he makes use of both Kazuha and Zillion. The two of them together buffing his damage percent and shredding res by 80% and 76% respectively, while also healing the man. Zillion also has the capacity to make geo-crystallized shields for the team, which, while not that impressive on its own, is a little bit of extra survivability that I feel like is worth noticing. To make the long story short, while these two characters are not inherently impressive on their lonesome, when matched together, or even by themselves on a team with a hyper carry DPS that's doing more than 60% of the team's overall damage, it is impressive how much they're able to push the envelope. And to think, on Kazuha's initial release, he was considered a mid version of Sucrose. And with that all being said, I'd like to thank Flip for coming on. Go support his channel, link down below. Like, comment, subscribe. See you all next time. Peace.